Welcome to the YWAM Kansas City podcast. We're here to activate our generation into missions and bring inspiration to live like Jesus in everyday life.
Today, I am joined by Gabrielle Nunez, a leader from the International House of Prayer, and we are talking about possibly the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5-7 is power-packed, it's full of foundational truths, and we're excited to discover it together. So, Gabe, I would love just to hear from you. It's so good to have you on our podcast.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yes. Could you share with us just a little bit about where you're from and a little bit of your family background?
Yeah, for sure. So, it's cool. Actually, I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, so I'm Canadian, and when I was just teeny tiny, there was an outpouring that started in Toronto.
Come on.
It's known now as the Toronto Blessing, or a big part of the Father's Heart movement was there. So actually I grew up from age 2 till like 10 in the middle of a revival, which is amazing. So
That's
from
crazy.
a very charismatic background, which I love. The awesome thing, I think, for me is it really made me hungry for the supernatural and hungry for experiencing the presence of God and not living like a normal Christian life, having an expectation for the Lord to break in and for his presence to really come and transform your heart and change you. So that's a bit of my background. I moved to Kansas City, though, when I was 17 and have a hunger for prayer, and I think I loved the prayer room too, because that was really a place to be in the presence of the Lord. So it's kind of how I got here. But yeah.
And I remember you shared this story with me once when you were, I think it was 17. You said that you really got gripped with God's heart and would be watching the Friday night services and tuning in and just asking the Lord to stir you for the book of Revelation and just going after prayer in his presence. So I love that he just like through the course of your life really marked you and you put those like stakes in the ground to go after him.
End times was a big message that grabbed my attention, but also it was really like this desire for wholehearted, like a wholehearted lifestyle. And I loved that I was seeing that come from IHOP. And obviously I had that in my background too, just like I want to be all in.
Yeah.
And so this wholehearted love, first commandment, loving God with everything really grabbed me as a teenager. And thank God by his grace, that's been the journey that he's had me on.
You've never been the same.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that. Well, today, we're talking about Matthew 5-7. I know that you've been diving into that and it's really impacted you, and even personally for me too. The Lord's really marked me for that. And I would just love to hear from you. What has the Lord been speaking to you about? What has stood out to you or has, been ministering to your heart?
Yeah. So these chapters,
so much too. I know
there's so
like...
much. No, and like on the verge of sounding like I'm about to exaggerate what I'm going to say, I honestly can just say if we were to boil down Christianity 101, it would come down to these 3 chapters. And there's a lot of things that we talk about in ministry, in life, and just wanting to love Jesus more. And a lot of the times those things are great. Like we hear motivational things of give your all and give your strength and, be radical or all of that stuff, which is amazing. But sometimes we lose that and in the etherealness of it all. And we don't always know how to boil it down to the practical.
Yeah.
Like what does this look like in my daily life? And in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, I just see Jesus painting in the clearest possible way. Like, you want to know how to love me with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all your mind, your strength. I tell you how to do it in these 3 chapters. And so to me, this is like the most practical roadmap that the Lord gives us to just say, if you live these 3 things, one, you're really fulfilling the purpose of our salvation, which we know in Romans 8, he says that we're going to be conformed to the image of his son.
Yeah.
these chapters, this is the way that Jesus lived when he walked on the earth. His life was in perfect congruence with these chapters. There was nothing, in these that he didn't himself first walk out. So that's a big one. But another one is these chapters really define what greatness is and what success in our life looks like. And, a lot of us will think we're successful based off of, maybe what our job is or our career or the amount of people we lead to the Lord. And all those things are amazing, but this really dives down into what the Lord calls great. Yeah. And so that's where when I see these chapters, I think, man, if I can align my life with the things that Jesus talks about in these chapters, that really is going to set me on the trajectory of him saying at the end of my life that I was successful in his eyes and great.
That's so good. I feel like it really is that realignment piece, because it's so easy to just be swayed back and forth of what culture demands as us, or even like as a Christian feeling like what it looks like to be successful or pass the test. But really the Lord brings it down to the place of our hearts before him and that wholeheartedness. So I love that you're sharing that. And maybe you can share this too. When did you first get marked by the Sermon on the Mount? When did it really grab your attention?
Yeah. Well, I think in just basic Bible reading, you kind of get to these chapters, and if you have one of the Bibles where Jesus's words are in red, it's
all red.
It's all red for 3 pages, and this actually is his longest sermon that he ever gives, or at least it's the longest recorded sermon in one place. And so in some ways it's I think just in life, you kind of come across these pages in red and you're like, okay, Jesus really went off here,
Yeah, he's emphasizing it.
He's emphasizing it. But I would say for me, when I really started to dive deeper into the Sermon on the Mount was a few years ago. I got invited to teach on an online course, and I got to choose whatever topic I wanted to. And Sermon on the Mount was one that I knew a little bit about, but just hadn't dug deeper into. I hadn't mined the gold that was in those chapters. And so this was probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I can honestly just say, from diving deep, writing out notes for these 3 chapters, I read a bunch of commentaries. It honestly was a life-changing moment, because I think a lot of light bulbs in my head went off related to oh, this is really important. And this is really, what I was saying earlier, this is really what Jesus wants for me in my life.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Just foundational for all of. I love that, the Christianity 101.
Yeah.
Was there anything while you were studying it, or even recently, that you felt in your heart of evaluating your own heart? Okay, I have this tension of this is how I'm living my everyday life, but then this is what you say in your word, Lord, and how do I align my heart with those truths? I don't know. Do you have any practical examples or moments of feeling that tension?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, even to dive into the sermon a little bit, I think, to me, I almost see this climax in Matthew 5:48. And it comes to the point, where Jesus goes through the Beatitudes, blessed are you, and he unpacks a few other things. But then he gets to this point at the end of chapter 5, and he says, you shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And to me, that is the biggest tension of this sermon, is he makes so clear, Jesus makes so clear what the standard for our life is. And it's to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. And I think to boil that down, to understand it a little bit easier, the way that I've heard that explained is also just to the degree that the Father walks in the light that he has, which we know he is light. He wraps himself in a garment of light, but it's also just, it's who he is. All the light that he has, he walks in. And in that same way, we're supposed to walk in all the light that God has given us to walk in, if that makes sense. So it's I just see this invitation of walking in grace, walking in all that the Lord has made available to us through the cross, through the Holy Spirit who lives inside of us. He's imparted this atomic bomb, so to speak, into our spirits, but we don't really live on much of that. We only access maybe a certain amount, and yet the standard is be perfect, walk in all of the light that's available to you. And so I think that's the biggest tension I find, but then it really gets boiled down in different things that Jesus puts his thumb on in these chapters. And I mean, if we're just going to start at the very beginning, I look at the Beatitudes, and like, honestly, I can't graduate past blessed are the poor in spirit. Yeah. And I call it the foundational beatitude because when I was studying it and looking at it, poverty of spirit really is this recognition of, apart from the cross, apart from the Holy Spirit, the gift of the Holy Spirit, the gift of justification in my life, I have nothing good. There was nothing that I could offer to the Lord. There was nothing that I could boast of, nothing that I could do to earn my own righteousness, salvation. And I look at that phrase that Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And he's saying, I want you to know, this is for the whole earth. I want you to know that this is really the reality of where you're living in. Meaning the whole earth is in this place of you have nothing apart from the Lord. And, I used to listen or hear that passage where Jesus, comes to, or I think it's the Pharisees are asking him, why do you eat with sinners and tax collectors? And he says to them, well, it's not, someone who's healthy doesn't need a physician. It's those who are sick, right? And I kind of used to read that and think oh, how kind and compassionate of Jesus that he would, dine with, the worst in society or the poor or whatever. But then it kind of hit me when I was reading about poverty of spirit, and it hit me that no, it's that the whole earth, that's our state. That's our spiritual state. We're all sinners. We're all the lowest of the low.
And sometimes we're just so blind to it.
We're so blind to it. Even in our Christian walk. It's because sometimes we think of all the things that we've done for the Lord, and the people we've led to the Lord, or the hours that we've put in prayer, or the years that we've given to serving him. And it makes us feel oh, okay, I am something in the Lord. Yeah, I earned it or whatever. And I love that Paul talks about in Philippians. He says, I leave even the good things behind and I press on. Yeah. I forget what's behind and I press on. And I just think knowing our poverty of spirit is this every day I need you, Lord. Every day I need a fresh filling of the Holy Spirit to live this sermon. I need a fresh filling of the Spirit to, even just love you today, to love my husband today, to be gracious with my children and not respond in anger. And, Jesus just gets so practical all throughout the sermon. But I love that he starts with, you have to recognize your need of me. If you don't recognize your need, you're not going to be able to do the rest of the 3 chapters. And so
good.
That's just the foundation that he starts on. And then he just builds and drills so deep into the heart from there. Yeah.
Oh, that's so powerful how it really does start with evaluating our own life, that we have to be willing to say that we're weak apart from him, that we have nothing, and that he has to come and help us. Because, reading through the Beatitudes, you realize that, gosh, I can't do this. Lord, it's impossible to be perfect. I need your Spirit. So it does really create that longing and drawing into the Lord deeper to lean into him.
Oh, for sure.
Today, what would you leave us with for us trying to apply the beatitude of being poor in spirit and just having that poverty of spirit? I know you were saying about us just asking the Lord, okay, God, I need you. Yeah. Would there be something that we could do on a I don't know, practical day basis where we like check our heart to evaluate if we're like operating from our own strength or really tapping into that, I don't know, place of waiting on him.
Yeah. I would say, something that I've prayed a lot and then I've recognized at different times, sometimes it's subtle, but when you really ask the Holy Spirit to highlight things to you and even to put his thumb on things, I ask him, like, put your thumb on the areas in my heart where I'm not in alignment with your leadership, where I'm not in alignment with the things that you say in this sermon. And it'll be interesting because he'll do it, you know? And sometimes it's just a subtle little whisper of like, you know what, bite your tongue right now. Like, don't respond in that way. Or it's recognizing when anger is flaring up in my heart, you know, in a response to something, or a lack of patience, or a lack of, long suffering, or, a big one, because again, Jesus just dives so deep, but is like the loving your enemies and the blessing those who revile you and speak against you. And so I think just to start, a really good place is to just talk to the Holy Spirit and say, would you highlight these things to me? Like, would you, in the day-to-day, show me where my life isn't coming into alignment with your leadership? And then when he does do that, it's about stopping, pausing for a moment and saying, okay, Holy Spirit, I thank you that you say that the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom. So I thank you that the kingdom is available to me right now. That everything that you've purchased and paid for on the cross, the kingdom is living inside of me. And therefore, I have full access to grace. I have full access to peace. I have full access to joy and to be able to respond in kind and not in anger. And I try to do that as much as, the Holy Spirit brings it to mind. Because we run into those, opportunities on a daily basis. For me, I'm a young mom of, a toddler, and we got a puppy, a quarantine puppy. And so it's just like, there are so many opportunities in a day to just be like, okay, thank you, Holy Spirit, for patience.
Yes, that's so good.
Thank you that you've given this to me by your Spirit, and it's available to me. And so I think that's a huge one. We just have to keep the conversation with him open and alive every day.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing with us. It's so powerful. I love how it can even just be practical, where we can ask the Holy Spirit and just realign our hearts and have him draw us into that place instead of feeling like a failure. Because I know for me, when we're seeing what we want to be, but we feel like we constantly aren't making the mark, we're not adding up, then we can feel like we're set back in discouragement. But I love when we turn it around and say, no, Lord, thank you that you've actually given me access. I can tap into it today. So I'm excited for us to continually go after this together, and we actually are going to have a follow-up conversation so we can talk more about the Sermon on the Mount. So we would love for you guys to tune in on the next episode, where we just talk more about the Lord going deep into our hearts and us really applying the Beatitudes and the truths of the Holy Spirit ministering to us and leaning on his understanding instead of our own. So tune in, subscribe, follow. You don't want to miss the next one. Thank you so much, Gabe, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, share, subscribe, and follow. And be sure to turn on your post notifications to be alerted with the next podcast coming out. Thanks for listening.